I'm sure you've noticed the older models sitting in the back room. Those are from the previous location, and we just use them for parts now. The idea at first was to repair them. They even started retrofitting them with some of the newer technology, but they were just so ugly, you know? And the smell.
When did Freddy Fazbear begin? And no, I'm not referring to the Freddy Fazbear's Pizza location. I'm talking about the character, more specifically, the animatronic of Freddy, and his band of Bonnie, Chica, and Foxy. Who created the first prototypes of them? And which were the first versions that the public got to see? Were the Unwithered animatronics ever a thing? And what came first, the Indo 02s or the Indo 01s? I sincerely believe that we can solve at least some of the FNAF timeline by using the characters in which we see in-game. But let's first walk through the various versions of the classic animatronics and where we saw them in release of the games. In FNAF 1, we were obviously introduced to the Classics animatronics, which consist of Freddy, Bonnie, Chica, and Foxy. These are their classic designs, and they use the Indo 01s. Very basic. Now, it's these four characters that would later be turned into multiple other versions, like the Toy Animatronics, the Nightmare Animatronics, but these were the basis for everything. Now, within FNAF 1, we play in a year which is speculated to be either 1983 or possibly 1998, along with a host of a bunch of other years. But it's told to us by these newspapers that the reason why the original, very first Freddy Fazbear's Pizza shut down was because someone in a mascot costume lured 5 children into a back room, murdered them, and stuffed their bodies into these animatronic classic suits, which then started to become a complaint amongst guests, and the pizzeria ended up shutting down. However, later we find out that these newspapers are not referring to the location which we are currently playing in FNAF 1, but rather a previous location. And so, moving on to FNAF 2, a lot of us thought this was going to be a sequel to FNAF 1, but come to find out it's actually a prequel. And in this game we learned that there was in fact a pizzeria that opened up before this Freddy's location. Phone Guy even talks about it being left to rot for quite a while, and that the animatronics which are found in the back room are from that location. Now, if we take a look in the back room, we find out that these animatronics look similar to the ones that we just faced in FNAF 1. However, they look a lot more scarier and they look wore down. According to Phone Guy, he tells us that these are the old animatronics and that they were going to repair them by retrofitting them with new technology. However, they turned out to be so ugly that they decided to go an entirely new route with the toy animatronics, which are the main show stage animatronics of the FNAF 2 pizzeria, or the 1987 location. And so by this point, a lot of us assumed that the Withered animatronics actually had their Unwithered versions, which were the main show stage animatronics of the first Freddy's location, which is where the MCI took place, which is what the newspapers in FNAF 1 was referencing. However, we will come back to that in a moment, as there has been newer information revealed that might tell us something about the Unwithered versions of the Withereds. Later releases such as FNAF 4, we were introduced to Fredbear and Spring Bonnie. Now, Spring Bonnie we had known about for a little while at this point, mainly since FNAF 3, and we connected the fact that this is the animatronic in which William Afton wore when he committed his MCI victim murders. And this animatronic can be linked to the newspapers from FNAF 1, as well as Phone Guy mentioning the fact that there was a yellow suit in the back used again in 1987. Also, throughout the training cassette tapes in FNAF 3 for how to use Springlock suits, we hear several mentions about the Fredbear and Spring Bonnie costumes, and this links up with that. We also see here another animatronic, which is Fredbear himself, which is supposed to be the predecessor to Golden Freddy since it has a similar design and overall looks the same. Also, there's a little bit of an Easter egg in FNAF UCN, where on sometimes when we see Golden Freddy, we can be jump scared by Fredbear with a purple hat and purple bow tie. I believe that this is an Easter egg connecting the fact that these are the same animatronic. Golden Freddy just came later. But one thing interesting to note here, since we're going to be talking about the Withered animatronics later, is the fact that this is supposed to be the model of Fredbear, which is what we see in FNAF 4. And if we compare this Fredbear model to the regular classic Freddy Fazbear from FNAF 1, they look extremely similar. It's basically just a recolor of FNAF 1's Freddy Fazbear being golden with a purple hat and purple bow tie. And this is very instrumental because according to Secret of the Mimic, we know that in 1979, Fredbear's Family Diner was open to the public. And therefore that means that this version of, quote, Freddy has existed since then. And later we obviously see it in the FNAF 4 minigames in 1983. Now it is still up for debate whether or not the pizzeria which we see in the FNAF 4 minigames is Freddy's or Fredbear's, but at least we know that in 1983 this model was being used. Well, now that we have that all laid out, let's discuss who created these animatronics, who invented the original spring locks, and who designed what characters. Now, before Secret of the Mimic came out, a lot of us were convinced of the fact that Henry and William were a lot more involved in the creation of the animatronics, as Henry and William were supposed to invent the first versions of the Springlock suits together, as well as design all of their beloved characters in which we have seen. I mean, after all, according to the books, Henry is supposed to be the engineer genius who designed a lot of the animatronics in which we see. However, if you're thinking about this from a business perspective, and William Afton being more of the businessman, this two-man team operation would need outside help to build many animatronics for their locations, as they would be busy managing everything. And that's when Secret of the Mimic came in to clarify many of these aspects, bringing into play the contractor known as Edwin Murray. Now, this wasn't the first time we had heard about Edwin Murray, as we had heard about him from the books. However, he is much different in the games as opposed to the books, just like always. According to the games, Edwin Murray inherited MCM from his father, who eventually passed away. But we also find out that his father, who we'll call Murray Sr., was already working with Fazbear Entertainment on some sort of designs, and even warned Edwin about the fact about not to trust Fazbear Entertainment completely. Edwin Murray had been contracted to work for them by building better costumes, make better designs, as well as build the animatronics in which Fazbear Entertainment would have in their locations. And as we played Secret of the Mimic, we were seeing multiple designs that we knew very well. For instance, this version of Chica, which was first debuted at Chica's Party World, eventually became Chica, which we know from FNAF 1. This was not a character that was originally designed by Henry or William. In fact, it came from Fiona, probably being one of the first characters that she designed, and some have attributed this aspect to the quote that we get from FNAF UCN of Chica saying, "I'm the first, I have seen everything," because she was one of the first animatronic designs created. Foxy is another example of this, as Foxy the pirate definitely seems to be something that came from Edwin Murray's costume manner, not directly something that Henry or William created themselves. What does appear to be created by Henry and William was the characters of Spring Bonnie and Fredbear, which later turned into Freddy Fazbear and Bonnie. These two characters are kind of the staple of Fazbear Entertainment. And obviously in the year of 1979 of Secret of the Mimic, we saw that Fredbear's Family Diner was open and had both Spring Bonnie and Fredbear, which we know according to FNAF 3 and the FNAF 4 minigames that these animatronics were Springlock suits. And so we have to ask ourselves who invented the Springlock suits. Well, something interesting that we learn in Secret of the Mimic is the fact that there are not just one version of Springlock suits. There are actually at least two versions. In Edwin Murray's home, in a bedroom inside of a closet, we see this endoskeleton, which basically looks like the lower half of Springtrap, which is a Springlock suit. However, we wear Springlock suits in Secret of the Mimic, and they look nothing like this, and they look like they are still under construction. That started raising some eyebrows for us, but then we heard this tape from Secret of the Mimic from Edwin Murray.
Test. Journal entry. I got the change order from Hen last night. Man, this makes sense. I'm almost done. Why change it now? It would be so much easier to keep using the spring locks. Just hire some teens to wear the suits like we always do.
Edwin Murray had been commissioned to make newer, safer spring locks for Fazbear, but they decided to scrap it entirely and go complete animatronic mode, which he was obviously annoyed with since the new spring locks were almost completed. So it is very safe to assume that Henry Emily was very much involved in the design of the original Springlock suits and probably commissioned Edwin Murray to mass produce them, but then they find out that they are dangerous. And so he begins work on the V2 Springlocks, which are supposed to be a lot safer, and which we kind of see in Secret of the Mimic. They seem to be way more stable as opposed to what we typically know from the FNAF 3 cassette tapes. Springlock suits seem to be very unpredictable, but to be honest, these don't seem that bad. And so at this point in time, we know that Spring Bonnie and Fredbear are both the V1 Springlock suits and are currently being used. And it is within this time of that change order something interesting happens. Fazbear Entertainment commissions Edwin Murray to work on something called the Fazbear Project, which if we go down in the basement of MCM, we find in the R&D department an entire mock pizzeria of what seems to be the FNAF 1 location, or possibly more likely the original Freddy Fazbear's Pizza location, the one where the MCI takes place in. This seems to be a whole research and development lab built to test these animatronics. And if we take a look around, we find multiple test animatronics of the original classics. But there was something interesting that I noticed. These are not what appear to be the unwithered versions of the withered animatronics that we see in FNAF 2 in 1987, but in fact they are just the plain classics using the Endo 01s like we see in FNAF 1. This got a lot of people thinking about what the very first versions of the classics actually looked like. But it also made some people more confused who wanted the Unwithereds to exist as to why they look so different from the classics. Let's just compare Classic Foxy and Withered Foxy. Their jaws are completely different, and if we look at their endoskeletons, they look very, very different. How on earth do we explain this? Well, if we use Secret of the Mimic as our guide, we can clearly see they were working on the Endo 01 versions of the classics. For the original Freddy Fazbear's Pizza location, which according to these tokens, opened in 1983. The token clearly states, since 1983, Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. I think it's also important to take a look at the face of the animatronic which we see on this token. If this token truly is from the first Freddy Fazbear's Pizza location set in 1983, the face in which is on the token is of classic Freddy, not an unwithered version of Withered Freddy. Which means that the prototype variants that we see in Secret of the Mimic most likely got turned into complete animatronics which are the classics, and debuted in this pizzeria in 1983. Now obviously we know that somewhere between 1983 and 1987 the MCI takes place. Some believe it takes place in 1985, while some believe it takes place in 1983. But whenever you think that this takes place, we do know this happens. William Afton lures 5 children into the back room and stuffs their bodies into these animatronic suits, hoping that no one will find them. It seems that this works for a while, although, as we all know, if there's bodies inside of animatronics, they are going to start to decay and stink. This therefore causes reports and causes the pizzeria to shut down in some unknown year. However, in FNAF 2, we do know that Ralph refers to it being left to rot for several years, so we know it couldn't have been in 1987. A couple of years had to have gone by. But Fazbear Entertainment most likely decided, as they tried to open this new location, to retrofit and repair the old animatronics from the first Freddy's location to use at their pizzeria. This is what Ralph refers to when he says repairing and retrofitting. However, most likely what they discovered when beginning to repair these animatronics was the bodies of the children. And it is not past Fazbear Entertainment to simply just throw these bodies out and try to move forward with the company. This is not the first nor the last time they have done something like this. They were literally betting in 1979 whether or not Arnold was going to survive meeting the Mimic or not. Yeah, did I mention that Fazbear Entertainment is a very twisted company, by the way? Now, if they are going to repair these animatronics which have been left to rot for a while with literally bodies decaying inside of them, there are going to need to be some massive changes to take place here. And so I believe by this point the Endo 02s had been invented and were better at mobility than the Endo 01s. I think we can clearly see that with comparison to the toy animatronics and the FNAF 1 animatronics. The toy animatronics are built way more for mobility than the FNAF 1 animatronics. animatronics. So they tried retrofitting the original classics to make the Withereds, but it seems that Fazbear Entertainment bit off more than they could chew because of how terrible and smelly condition these animatronics truly were. So they decided to completely scrap them and turn their eyes to new skies. And that became the toy animatronics. And now this is a bit more of a theory, but I do believe that William Afton played a major role in this decision. Mainly because I think there is a lot of evidence to point to the fact that the toy animatronics are killing machines very similar to the Funtime animatronics, which I also believe are being built in a similar time frame of the toy animatronics. And I mean, just look at them, the designs look very similar. But that's another video for another day. Least to say, the toy animatronics become the main attraction of the FNAF 2 location, but obviously we know from the FNAF 2 newspapers in 1987, after only a couple weeks of being open, these animatronics are then scrapped due to the malfunctions of their programming. But it is said that the originals are being kept for a possible reorganization of the company, which we all know eventually turns into FNAF 1. But you might say, again, the Withereds look completely different from the classics, so how did they go from looking like this to the Withereds and then back to the classics? And that's where the book, The Week Before, comes into play. Ralph has a very interesting line when he sees Freddy Fazbear. He claims that he is very happy that they went back to his old design with his classic look. This is a major lore drop and basically confirms what we see in Secret of the Mimic, with the fact that the classics came first, then the Withereds, then the classics. And so even though it might seem strange, no matter how Fazbear Entertainment did it, they definitely went this route with trying to retro redesign the Withereds, but then had to just go back to the basics. And what better makes sense to go back to the basics with using some scrap endoskeleton 01s that they still had left over from their very first Freddy Fazbear's Pizza location. And that pretty much explains it, using the characters of the FNAF timeline to help us better understand the early events of Fazbear Entertainment and FNAF. And if you want to hear a very interesting theory on what year the FNAF 1 game took place in, check this video out right here, it's absolutely insane. And with that, I hope you all enjoyed today's video. Make sure to subscribe, and I will see you next time. Have a fantastic day.